Hello, everybody. This is Constance from Mysterious Galaxy. Thank you very much for joining us. Tonight, we have an evening of horror, but yet in a very delightful and awesome way. We have an evening of horror that is accurately, the book is accurately titled Screaming for Pleasure, How Horror Makes You Happy and Healthy. And the author, S.A. Bradley, is in the house with us, and he's going to be in conversation with Mary Kay McBrayer. And is it McBrayer? I'm sorry if I pronounced
that's perfect.
Woo! Ha! It's not a name that I've mispronounced. But I'm really excited because we have a lot of really great horror enthusiasts at the store that come in and can come back. And if they're not watching today, can come back and watch it, because your book is what so many horror lovers love. It's celebrating why horror is so freaking amazing. And I'm really excited to hear you guys talk about it. I feel like horror is as dark as it is healing, which I know is one of the things that gets touched on as well. But I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Mary Kay. Before I disappear, though, just to give everyone the Vanna White little section, as I call it, if you have any questions, make sure you ask them. That's the best part about events, is that they are at your mercy for you to ask questions. And to do so, down below, you will see a button that, as would make sense, says Ask a Question. If you click that, it'll prompt you to ask a question. And if you want to find out even more amazing and awesome thing about horror books, as well as support an author and a local independent bookstore, I can do nothing but encourage you to hit that buy button down below. And you can even get a personalized book plate. Yes, this is where we all do this. But thank you so much for joining us tonight. I am going
Got
to
my
exactly. You can get the autograph. But I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Mary Kay. And thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. I will see you guys at the end of the event.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Thank y'all so much for spending the last full night of the longest year of our lives with us. Really excited to talk to S.A. Bradley about his book, Screaming for Pleasure, like Constance said, How Horror Makes You Happy and Healthy. Just like she said, the talk will go something like this. We'll have about 30 minutes of discussion, and then we want to hear your questions, because that is the funnest part for authors. I also want to say, just as a former teacher, when you think of a question, just go ahead and put it in there. Otherwise, like, you might forget, or if you're like me, you might lose your nerve, and we don't want to miss out on questions that are really juicy. So go ahead and put them in there. We might not do them like right away, but we'll do them, not at the end, but like at the second part, if you will. So go ahead and pop that in there when you think of it. And with no further ado, let me introduce y'all to S.A. Bradley. This is going to be such a treat. Oh my gosh, I practiced introducing you because this is amazing. Okay. S.A. Bradley is the host of the popular podcast Hellbent for Horror, exploring all things horror across books, film, comics, and music. With over 1,600 horror films under his belt, Bradley has turned his passion into purpose, sharing his expansive knowledge on dozens of podcasts and in anthologies like Medium Chill, which is a great title. That was just me editorializing it. That's not in the official. And Evil Speak magazine. Hellbent for Horror is a 2-time Rondo Hatton Classic Horror Awards nominee for Best Multimedia Horror Site, and was described by, are y'all ready for this, director Guillermo del Toro, that's right, as well-researched, articulate, and entirely absorbing. I would put that on my resume like immediately. That's amazing. Bradley's first book is the one we're here to talk about, Screaming for Pleasure, How Horror Makes You Happy and Healthy. It's a thrilling ride through the horror genre and its intense effect on every generation. And he shows you how you can be enriched by horror, and it is a delight. So...
Oh, yeah. My goodness. Thank you so much. And I'm always overjoyed to be dealing with like bookstores like Mysterious Galaxy. And what wasn't mentioned is that Mary Kay McBrayer has done quite a bit of journalism and writing of her own. And she even has her own book. And I did bring her book, America's First Female Serial Killer. Yeah. Jane Toppin and the Making of a Monster. It's a great book. If you were a fan of Devil in the White City, this has some similarities in how it likes to look at what's going on in society around some psychosis. And it's really interesting. I love your book. So we'll have to talk about yours as well. So that's what's cool. It's not just me sitting here talking. It's writers and readers enjoying the art.
Brigade.
Yeah. And I've also been on your podcast. So for Mary Kay McBrayer, she's the author of the book that I just showed you. She's also co-host of a comedy podcast about horror movies called Everything Trying to Kill You. Now that's a title. And I think I was on to talk about the autopsy of Jane Doe.
That's right. It's one of my favorite episodes. It was so fun.
It was great. And what you did is you opened my eyes to how just by a few years, a generation can change how you look at a horror film, what is seen on the screen. So you folks noticed some things that I just took for granted because I'm like, oh, well, that's what autopsy rooms always look like. There are always chalkboards on the wall. There's always this stuff. And you're going, when was the last time anybody used a chalkboard? I'm going, oh, that's interesting, because it takes, it brings this whole almost like a Hammer horror film that there is this feeling to in that movie. It brings it to a different time. And there's a couple movies that came out this year that did kind of the same thing, where you're not sure what decade or time period the movies are taking place. There's some new material that's in there, some new technology, and then there's like corded phones in the wall, like in movies like The Beach House. So it's really interesting. You caught on to something that, for me, because I grew up in doctors' offices that used to go to, and everything was wooden and big phones and big bottles of stuff with things floating in them. That was just common. Now that's like may as well be Frankenstein's laboratory, right? And that's so
amazing. Every time I walked into a room with a chalkboard on it, I was a teacher, I would just be like, oh, this is punishment for my sins. Like, what's this? Going into a doctor's office with like preserved organs and stuff, that sounds like a dream.
Well, growing up with that kind of thing in like biology class, I mean, I was made to be a horror person because I grew up in this really gothic. Yeah, all this crazy stuff that I lived with, and lived in the coal mines. People like just disappear in holes that would open up in the ground. So it's like, yeah, what the hell? Either comedy or horror, and I think the two are pretty close.
All about timing, right?
All about timing, exactly.
Well, my first question for you, and we kind of already are getting into it, is, and I know this is one of the questions that you like to ask based on your book that I read. What was your first kiss with horror? So, like, what was the thing that made you really lean into it?
Oh, great. And since we have people on that are watching and listening, thank you for being on. Welcome. And I want to give you the question, too. You can put it in Q&A or the chat room, whatever. What was your first kiss with horror? And what I talk about with the first kiss is it's the movie that kind of set you down this path. You know, just like the first kiss, it may have been a horrible experience, but you became somewhat really excited by it, and you found that there was something about this genre that really spoke to you. And so I love talking about first kisses because they're usually illicit. They're usually done before you should be. So we mostly see something that we shouldn't be watching. You know, we're young and we do something against the law, against the rules, that is, of our families and our friends, and we get stung by it. And so it may not be something that was a lot of fun, but it was something that was impactful. And I think when you have that, you either go, well, that's not for me. Don't really like horror. That was a disturbing thing. I often go watch Charlie Brown's special, and that's where I'm going to stay. Or you end up like me, where you're horrified for days. You can't sleep for days, and then you got to go back, and it's almost like hair of the dog that bit you. You know, I had to go back to this. And mine is a very esoteric one. It's always strange, and the first chapter of my book is based on it. It was a movie I shouldn't have been seeing. It's an art film that is also a horror film. It's widely recognized as a classic now, but when it came out, it really was notorious. It's called Don't Look Now. Don't Look Now by Nicholas Roeg. It stars Donald Sutherland and Julie Christie, and it's all about premonitions, the supernatural, ghosts, and guilt and grief. And it's about memory. And Nicholas Roeg made movies a lot differently than a lot of other people do. Now you have people like Nolan. Christopher Nolan is definitely a disciple of the Nicholas Rogue School, which is you start the movie at a certain time period and you can switch times, you can switch places, colors sometimes have deep meaning. There are visual puzzles happening all the way through the film. And I was not ready for that. I was a kid who had seen like Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, things like that. And the first 5 minutes of that movie, if you talk to horror fans who have seen it, you talk to cinema people who have seen it, they will always say that that is one of the hardest things to watch in cinema. The first 5 minutes of Don't Look Now is one of the most suspenseful, dread-filled, and sorrowful things that happens. And it has to do with a family tragedy that happens right underneath the nose of the parents. A child dies. And the way that it's done, the visual sense of it, the imagery that has to do with churches and stained glass windows and blood and red. All of this went into this ultra-Christian fundamentalist cult that I was in as a kid. And so all of this was like saying, Satan, Satan, Satan. And I was scared to death. And what happened, I look back at it now, why that hit me so hard was at the time my parents were in the middle of the divorce. It was ugly. They were trying to keep it from me. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know what. And I felt my whole world was coming apart, that I was going to what do you do when you lose mom and dad? Where am I going to go? Who's going to take me? What does this mean? And I had all of these thoughts that I couldn't let out. And then I'm watching this movie where this kid dies in front of their parents. And you might think that what it was that got me about that was a child dying. But the reality was it was about your parents may not be able to save you. Your parents may not be there for you.
That's heavy.
Yeah, and that was, I had that in me. As a kid, I could not articulate that. I only kind of knew that because I kind of felt I transferred Donald Sutherland into my dad and Julie Christie into my mom. And so I saw mom and dad. I didn't see actors. I didn't see this other family. I saw them. And so there was this whole thing of the fear, the deep-seated anxiety that I had as a kid. And that scared me terribly. But then I found that I wanted to watch it again. And I think part of it was I was no longer alone. These thoughts that were in my head, I thought I was the only person in the world that had them. I was the only one that was going through the hell that I was going through. All of this stuff, it was all happening to me. And just having someone else agree with it, know what it was, make a movie about it. And that's happened with books. That's happened with The Exorcist and several other things that I've read. They come in my life at the right time to save me when I feel as if no one can understand. And I think horror works on that. The inarticulate energy inside of us. We go to, we talk about emotions and self-help and all of that. And it's like, well, you can't even go to a psychiatrist. It's like, well, what are you feeling? It's like, I'm feeling, bleh. You can't even come up with a word for what you're feeling. Sometimes emotions, deep-seated things, traumas are so complex. And sometimes it's just feeling alone. You don't know how to express that. Horror touches it like music does. Horror finds that thing and it's able to work upon you. It's able to kind of get past this thing, the brain that constantly has to look at things analytically. Music and horror, they work on a visceral level that's right in the feelings, right in the gut. So we don't have to understand why it works, but it works. Mm-hmm. And so I've always tried to honor that with horror. I found that it saved my life in some ways, so I'm always kind of thinking about it. So if anybody has what theirs is, mine is one you've never heard of before called Don't Look Now. Go look it up. You'll hate me later.
That's
How about you? What's yours?
Well, I can't agree more with you about the thing that drew me to horror without really knowing that I enjoyed it, because I think, and you mentioned this in your book as well, a lot of horror is like not classified as horror because it's more like horror seems not as highbrow or as elite as some of the other genres do. And we all here know that that's not true, but they try to, rebrand it as a thriller or a psychological thriller or something like that. So I was all about those and didn't really know that I just didn't like body horror wasn't specifically for me. But that doesn't mean that, all horror is not for me. It's a branding issue. So I can't agree more. Circling back to what my original point was, which was that it puts the things that scare you in a controlled environment. Like even if it doesn't turn out the way that you hope that it will, or even if it does and that's not how it works in real life, there is a path in the movie, and that is how it happens in the movie. It is a narrative. A causes B causes C, even if it's not the causality that you wanted. It's a lot more streamlined and linear than real life, and that really helps me personally, like, cope with trauma. Like my first kiss. I every time you ask me this question, I think I have a different one. But one of them that was really scary to me that we've talked about before, I think we talked about this last time we talked, but the Bible stories used to really scare me when I was a kid, especially the Old Testament ones, like when the little kids sass Elijah the prophet, and then he's like, I'm gonna fix you, and he sends those bears to eat them. My grandfather told me that when I was a kid, and I was like, what am I supposed to do with this information? Like, I'm a little sassy kid, I don't know what to do. It's so, I mean, that's not a movie specifically, but like most recently, I think the one that I identified with the most was Midsommar, because she's in that shitty relationship. I'm sorry, can I swear on here? I wasn't.
Yes.
Oh, okay. He's so shitty, but he's not like actively abusive. So it's like, it's just like a liminal space where something terrible happens, and she's kind of trapped in this relationship. And I can remember at the end just being like, and I'm not going to spoil it in case y'all haven't seen it, you're in for a treat, because it is truly horrific. But like, she has a choice to make, and I was like, I'm going to be so disappointed if she doesn't pick the one that I would not have wanted myself to pick. Like, it's the obvious choice, but she doesn't. You don't want to do it as a person, but you want somebody to do it for you, type thing. Like where they'll do it on your behalf, like act as your proxy and get that vengeance. Like The Descent. Do you remember The Descent?
Oh, I love The Descent.
Great one. I think it's Juno, the protagonist that we're not supposed to really like. And she turns around and she's like in combat mode, and then she accidentally spikes her friend in the throat. And it's like, wow. Yep. That's exactly. Yeah. So now that we're into like what we love about horror, I wanted to know, and this is always something that I want to ask when I go to author talks, but I always lose my nerve because it's kind of, I don't know that it's like an easy question, so we can skip this one if you don't like it. Because your book it has such an interesting cocktail blend of genre. So it's like part memoir, part essay, and part film analysis. And so I was wondering how this is kind of like a two-parter question, or three series of questions, but
all right.
How did you decide on that format? And in general, I kind of just want to know like how you got started, and what was like, did you always set out knowing that it would be somewhat like a book of essays that would have an overall narrative also, or did it start as one, or like what was the thing that made that made you go like, I can do this, I'm doing it, and then from there?
Well, that's a great question.
Oh, good. Okay.
I think it's interesting that you talk about the cocktail, that there's this thing of like, I think if there's a bunch of folks here who are horror fans and they read fiction, that's one thing. If they read nonfiction, they know that there's a bunch of books out there that get really dry really fast when they start talking about why horror does what it does. And it's like comedy. Once you start dismembering it, it becomes unfun. It's all about the idea of having this energy. And so I didn't want to go down that path. And yet I felt this compelling thing to tell a story that had to do with the love of horror. And so there are a group of folks out there. I don't use the term true horror fan or real horror fan. I think that's all bullshit. I think we're too heavily relying on labels, and horror is way too subjective to be able to say that there's one thing that can be horror. What scares you may not scare me. But there is something about a passion level of fans. So many fans, most fans, and there's nothing wrong with this, are happy to watch a film and be done with it. Then there are those that have a desire to watch the film and it impacts them in some way, they go, I got to see everything that this person's done. And they go and they do that. And then there's the other person who does that and then says, I got to research this as well, because what they're talking about is really interesting. Oh my God, there's reference books. So there's that. And then there's the next step, which is I have done all of that. I go to conventions because I wish to talk to the people who are making this. And then I am compelled to create myself. And so there is this thing where fandom goes to a certain level. All these are little stepping stones. It's like the gateway drug is just watching a horror film. And then you go down this thing. If you're of a certain type of person, you need to know, you want to know, you're passionate about that, you get an intimate relationship with art or whatever it is that gets you excited, you find yourself going down this path. And just about all the friends that I have who are into horror that are what we call convention family, they're all creators. They're all people who draw, they write books, they put on podcasts, they make independent films. They cannot sit and just take it in. They need to create, they need to give it back. There's this whole feeling of like, you want to share this crazy feeling that you have when you find people, especially that have the same kind of love that you do. So I come from that place. So the storyline, how I wanted to tell the story was how I speak a lot. The circumventuous way that seems like it's a bunch of little stories that suddenly come together at the end. And a lot of that is radio. I guess if I had anything that is like kind of how my style comes from, it's from a guy named Paul Harvey that used to have this show on the radio called The Rest of the Story. And this was back in the days when I was a kid and my dad would drive us from Pennsylvania to Florida to go to Disney World. Bunch of kids in a Subaru, and we're just like ready to kill each other. And he put on this guy who had this incredibly soothing voice. And he would tell stories of like current events, and then he would go, and then there's the rest of the story. And then he'd do a deep dive. And he would start going, here's what you see, here's the perception, here's what really happened. And it was so interesting to have somebody turn something that was news into a drama and then bring his own personal, whether he liked to or not, he could not keep his personality out of it. And that all kept coming back to like a Garrison Keillor thing. There's this whole idea of being the bard, the storyteller of this stuff, but also bringing in the things that you love. So it ended up being this thing of I wanted to talk about the specific things that I see in horror. I'm also a big arguer. So I've learned the fine art of debate since I was a 10-year-old. And it's the thing of I can't just tell you you're crazy. I've got to give you footnotes on why you're crazy. And so that's the kind of thing that helps as a writer, and it gets you really excited to, this is why I'm passionate. No, it's not I like it. Here's the reasons I like it. And so that had to be in there as well. And then just the idea of I'm grateful for having something that I'm so excited by. So like I say that horror makes you happy and healthy. It's not going to cure your lumbago. It's not, you shouldn't get off your meds to watch horror movies. These are not my ideas of a good idea. But what I say about horror is that it allows you to get your sense of play again. Several times in my life, I was kind of saved in a way. I got a refresher of what makes me happy through horror films or through talking to people about horror films, just getting ignited by my passion again. So a sense of play, getting your passion again, finding out that you have an ability to look at the dark sides of yourself and have a handshake with that Jungian shadow, the idea that you have this part of you that is always going to go to the darkness. And if you don't take a look at that, it's just going to stay in the darkness. There's always light near the dark. You don't get shadows without light. And so there's this whole concept of being able to take a look at that through horror. It's a safe way. You mentioned it before that the real world is messy, but I have some order in a horror film. I also have a semblance of control. I can't control the price of meat or gas or anything like that, but I can control whether or not I finish a book or a movie that scares me. And if I make it through, I feel as if I've accomplished something. And the idea of being able to hold on to and control something that normally I'd be afraid to be anywhere near has its own peak to it. Being able to understand that you can find family in this way. You can find people who are just like you and find a way to be entertained by this and be enriched. You learn to be a teacher in a way. You learn how to speak to people when you get passionate about whatever it is. So there's many things that you can say to make you happy and healthy. I'm saying that horror is not in some sort of jail where it can't be that. So if you can be good with parts of yourself that sometimes you can be embarrassed by, you have a sense of play again, you find yourself passionate, and you've got a group of people, a community that suddenly reaches out to you. That's a pretty good life. So that's why I think that horror is good for happiness and healthiness. I hope that answered.
Yeah. I mean, it's not like you get partial credit type thing, like we're just talking. So.
Wow, we got some questions.
Yeah,
So,
we do. Really good ones too. Oh, all of them are good. I think the one that probably goes best with like what we were just talking about is which horror story helped you heal the most, because that's kind of what we were talking about just a moment ago. So do you have one offhand, or maybe if you have more than one, like the most recent one?
Sure. If I had to talk about the one that probably was the most healing, I think I talk about it in this context in the book, but it's William Peter Blatty's The Exorcist, reading The Exorcist.
Reading it. Okay.
Yeah, reading it long before I should have. Yeah. I read it. They let me take it out of the library, and the library system saved my life in its own way, because I came from a very poor family, and my dad was functionally illiterate, so he didn't know that books were what they were. He saw it as homework. Anytime he had to open a book, he had to do something, right? And so he let me read, and he thought Jaws was going to be less scary as a book. He didn't know there was sex scenes on every other page in the book Jaws. So I got corrupted early by books. But because I was in a fundamentalist religion that truly believed that demons are right here waiting for you to screw up and then possess you and torture you and torture your family, nothing was scarier to my family than The Exorcist. They did not see the social commentary or anything like that. They saw it as a documentary. And so they were very, very scared by it, and I was scared about it. And so it was like bringing in a cursed object to read The Exorcist. And so what happened with The Exorcist is I did not become possessed after reading it. And the first page I thought I might get, because you open it up, and what's not in the movie is the first page of The Exorcist is a list of all these human atrocities. There's a news report about Vietnamese soldiers jamming chopsticks into the eardrums of all these kids at a school because the guy had sung or had them pledge allegiance to the flag. There's a tape of a Costa Nostra, the mob, killing a guy by putting him on a meat hook, and the guy was so fat that he made the meat hook bend, and they were hitting him with cattle prods. No reason for these. It's just a list. He never gives you an answer, but by the end of the page, you're really disturbed, and you're almost like, what is this? Is this some kind of strange conjuring? This porn? What is this? And it really scared me when I read that. And then I was afraid that, I've opened myself to demons. So all night I'm waiting to get possessed. I can't sleep. I tried reading it at night because I had to hide the book. I put it in my closet, and I had to put the book face down because it was the original copy cover, which is this really blurry picture of this girl. And it's like, oh man, it's so disturbing. And so everything, when you're scared, everything becomes like a religious item. Right? It all has this special meaning. So I'm scared to death, and I wake up in the morning and I'm not possessed. And that breaks down a lot of walls just by having this thing of what my family said would absolutely happen, and it didn't happen. Happening again and again, and it happens through horror, it happens through science fiction as well. Harlan Ellison is a writer who was big in my life because he was an editor of this book called Again, Dangerous Visions and Dangerous Visions. And there's a story in there that basically took all of my fears of religion and my doubts about religion and put them in a story. And it was like, somebody's reading me. And these were healing and freeing things that allowed me to walk away and allowed me to grow up a little bit. It allowed me to start a quiet revolution, which is what I think books are. Movies are loud revolutions. They're firebombs and Molotov cocktails. But you can literally be, torturing someone with your words on a bus right next to someone who's reading Boy's Life. And you can both coexist without any issues. So great question. I would say The Exorcist is the biggest one. And there are several through the times that were affected me in a way that changed my worldview. And I love to bring up The Exorcist because I think that's one of the more timeless ones. And I think that's a question that someone asked too.
Yeah.
Something Something about timeless. Let me look it up very quickly. What horror stories, movies, TV, or books do you think stand the test of time, are impactful no matter when you watch them? That's a great question, because
truly,
I had a podcast about that, where I had someone on who was, I guess, for lack of a better word, millennial, from that generation. I'm a Gen Xer, and we had someone who was in that in-between state. And we were talking about movies because we wanted to say, everybody watched these few films. Do they still have the impact? Because I grew up, The Exorcist was playing in the theaters when I was just a tot. So it was real deal shit. It wasn't something that, oh, by the way, we can take a look at it on VHS. It was happening, and it was scaring the country. And people were going to church over this movie, and people were fainting. All of this stuff was happening in real time in my life. So when I watch that movie, I see a completely different Exorcist. I am stuck in that time capsule. So I would like to say that movies like The Thing, I like to see what ones people come to, and they go, yeah, that still makes sense. There are several that I thought would always make sense that don't. I would say that Gremlins does okay with people, but Jaws will always do well. I think Jaws is like a perfect primal horror film. It is the Steven Spielberg successfully turns the entire ocean to the underside of your bed, and you don't want to put your foot over it, and everyone can understand that, and is universal. I think The Thing works because it hits on, it's very small. If you look at John Carpenter's The Thing, it was very transgressive for the time, but it's really in a couple rooms, and then there's outdoors, which is isolated and everything. So it doesn't date in ways that other films do. It already feels kind of out of time. But its idea is this thing of identity and loss of identity and the end of the world. So I think that will always work in that place. I think that it's also very hard to say about surviving the test of time, because I think sometimes the stories change. Like if you look at something like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, there's been a great Invasion of the Body Snatchers story in just about every decade, and it's updated to the anxieties of that decade. So the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers can either be seen as an indictment of McCarthyism or an indictment of communism, which is really interesting. Either way, it can work. It depends on who's looking at the metaphors at the time. And then you go to the Me Generation, Hedonism, in the 70s one. And then there's the one that Abel Ferrara did in the 90s, which was about the military-industrial complex and everybody turning into soldiers, everyone looking exactly the same. I think this is what's really cool about a story like that, is that it when it's touching on something that is thoroughly primal, those are the stories that are going to last the longest. What the wrapping is on them may get moldy, and then you just take that wrapping off and you put it back in. Movies date a lot more than other forms of entertainment do. Books, strangely enough, the language may date, but in a way, that's almost like the flavor of a special cheese or a wine or something like that. Right. I read guys from the early 20th century, late 1900s, and their use of the language is intoxicating and fun and exciting and really fast-paced. You don't want to read a Stephen King after you read an Algernon Blackwood, because Stephen King takes 25 pages to tell you about the meatloaf that he's eating. Whereas these guys were like, bam, bam, bam. They were just pulling it through. So that tends to not date as much. If you're a book reader, you're already kind of out of time, I guess. And so the book doesn't go down the tubes like a movie does. But a movie is this culmination of all the arts that are happening at that time. You need to have painting, you need to have lighting, you need to have acting, you have all of the arts come together in film. And so I think it's much easier for it to date, because you're always trying to do something of the now. You see movies that don't date as much will be like, I'll bet you Bram Stoker's Dracula, the one done by Coppola. I think that one probably is going to be the Dracula that dates the least, because it tries to be all different time periods. It's got 30s in it. It's got this semi-modern feel to it. It's got this incredible color
in there.
Yeah. So you have all that stuff, whereas most of the time it's a dusty, dusty thing. Like, I love Dracula. It's one of my favorite characters ever. Try watching Todd Browning's Dracula. As a historian, it's magnificent.
Yes.
As a viewer, and it's just like, Yeah, it's got some serious dry creaker moments. And Frankenstein's better. Frankenstein's better, but it's still a little bit slow paced. And that's my favorite horror story of all time is Frankenstein. Because I think Frankenstein asks the key question that horror is to ask, which is, where do monsters come from? And that answer can be all sorts.
To your point, I do think that book aged better than even the one starring Boris Karloff. But I think that Bride of Frankenstein does adapts the book more accurately.
Yes.
And the old one, the one
James Whale. Right.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. That's a good point, though, about that books age better. And I wonder, too, if it's because from a marketing standpoint, like movies have to be somewhat trendy so people will go, you know?
I think so.
They don't have to do it as much. They don't have to. They can, but they don't have to.
Yeah, it's interesting because things that are actually amazing now may not be amazing later. Like I remember when Star Wars was re-released in 2000. I remember when I saw Star Wars in 1977, there was no faster movie, there was no bigger movie, there was no wilder movie. It was like, oh my God, it was everything. A pirate movie, it was a Western, it was a samurai film. It was, holy shit, what is this? And then I watched it in 2000. I'm like going, wow, it's taken a while for them to get to that bar. What's going on here? So it's funny how time and pacing and what is how stories are told at any given time. Film is very much a pop culture phenomenon. It does age pretty quickly. And I think unless it's a movie that is playing in a different period, it can get strange. And even ones like 1917, I'm going to be interested to see how that ages in about 10 years, because that's an extremely interesting story now with the technology that we have now, what could be done with cameras. The story is super simple. There's very little story, actually. It's all about the horrors of war. And you have this constant moving camera. If we don't go further in film, that's always going to be a really interesting movie to look at. I think some of Kubrick's films are like that, where they're really interesting to look at. I don't know if they really connect with people as much as they did at one point. But I'm interested to see if 1917 is going to still feel like this really in-your-face movie of it's happening now in the now, or it's just going to look like a guy running around. You know, if it doesn't hold that, it's just going to be a guy running around. And you're going to be like, what the hell has happened to this movie? So it's really interesting. You play Russian roulette when you're making horror films or any film. Nobody expected Texas Chainsaw Massacre to become the masterpiece that it is now, where it's, if it's not
up for real.
Yeah. That's one that I don't think dates, because it doesn't feel like it's of any time. It feels like it feels like poverty is what it feels like. Mm-hmm. It feels like this. It's a story of forgotten people, and they were forgotten in '74. They're forgotten in 2014. They're forgotten in 2020. There's always going to be this group, and so that movie kind of hits on how we're afraid of that. We're afraid of this group that's forgotten. If we get stuck in the wrong place, gonna get eaten. So it is this interesting deal that movie is so analog. There's a million reasons but no one ever tries to make phone calls. The only thing that's technologically in that movie is they're running out of gas. But other than that, it could be a fairy tale. And that's the amazing thing about Texas Chainsaw. For as nasty of a name as it has, it is really a work of insane fever dream art. And I think it holds a test of time, because when people watch it, they're like, it's so out there. It's like, you're asking me about, is it accurate? Is it of the time? I have no idea. I don't even know if these people fucking exist, but they scare the shit out of me. David Lynch kind of goes down that path. I'm sure David Lynch was inspired by Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Tobe Hooper, because there's just that strange thing of people in and out of twilight in their brains and in their actions that I see in his films. That's also in there as well. Oh, I see Joel Golden. I just wanted to say thank you, Joe. I see in the chat room on the side that you started reading the book. You love the part where we watched the thing in the movie theater with your dad. Curious, thank you. And I'm curious what you thought of the 2011 The Thing prequel. Oh, yeah, I wasn't a huge fan, but I have to say my horror curiosity makes me want to go back and see it a couple times. And that's one of the weird things about horror. You don't necessarily have to like a movie to want to see it again, because you want to almost see, what did I feel? Was it just that I didn't get it at that point? What is happening? And so the Thing 2011, the problem that I had with it wasn't what many people had with the CG and everything. That didn't really bother me that much. What bothered me is that, just like many times with prequels, they have an end point they have to get to. So the whole movie is, how do we limp along in really weird dialogue to get to the point where we're going to make the guy with the two faces, right? How are we going to have them somehow originally look at something that we saw in 1982 that was, how do they just, oh my God, they discover that there's, the characters are morphing into each other, and all of that was original when we saw The Thing. But when we see it in the 2011, that's already a done deal. It's a fait accompli. We already know that's going to happen. So there's no suspense for us. We also know nobody's going to make it. So there's no suspense for us. So it's really tough with a prequel. You have to come up with something truly unique. And I didn't think that the idea of the beast, it squirts out anything that's foreign material that's not organic. So it's like braces are falling on the ground. I think. So there's this great unfortunate moment where they're screaming, "Show us your teeth." So that is supposed to be the moment that is like the blood test in 1982's The Thing, this tense thing of, how are we going to know who the monster is? Well, we can't do the blood test again. That's very well known. How are we going to make a change of that? And they decided people have fillings. So if you have no fillings, you're either an extremely good dental person or you're The Thing. And so there's the thing of holding someone up against a wall going, "Show me your teeth." That's a regrettable line, man. That made me laugh out loud. That's just not scary. It's absurd. And so even with all of that said, there are still good scares in it. There's still some interesting dread that's in it. And I do love tone. But it's not one of my favorites. As, you know, I hate to knock anything too hard, but that's what I would say, is that there's just this contextual issue that you have to do something completely crazy or own it. One of the things that I really love was the remake of The Town That Dreaded Sundown. Town That Dreaded Sundown, as a drive-in exploitation film, was one of the better ones. It's actually pretty violent, pretty disturbing, and Dawn Wells was in it. Rest in peace, Dawn Wells. She died today. Mary Ann from Gilligan's Island. Dawn Wells had a part in the original Town That Dreaded Sundown. She gets shot in the face. And so it was really a disturbing, kind of interesting crime pot boiler. The remake says that movie exists, takes place in Texarkana, Texas. And Texarkana is it Texas and Kansas? What are the two Texarkanas? Right next, Arkansas.
Yeah.
So that the two Texarkanas and how they don't talk to each other. And they put in all the conspiracy theories that there's ever been about this murder into the movie. So it's self-referential without being like too jokey like some people find Scream. So it's really interesting. They update things, but they also update it with the idea that the killer has seen the movie and is trying to update the killings and stuff like that. So I thought that was, if you're going to have to do a remake, if you're going to do a prequel, find an original way to do it. And sometimes you can't, and then you have to do the punk rock thing, which is embrace all the copycatting that you're doing and make something that's kind of interesting. And that was one of my favorite remakes of the last several years. Oh my goodness. I think I'm talking too much.
No, this is all about you. We did have another question, though, about what you think that 2020 will mean for the horror genre.
Ooh, what do I think? 2020 is going to mean to the horror genre. That's an interesting thing, because I've been calling 2020 like the Decameron 2020. Everybody's at home. The plague is happening. Everybody's trying to continue to have this life in a different thing. I think structurally it's going to change things. Like theaters, that's going to change a little bit. What we can do virtually is going to change a little bit. And as for story, I'm not sure. What I will tell you is that it's going to take a while till we want to hear stories about plague and COVID, because some of the books that I was reading this year, like Paul Tremblay's book, I love Paul Tremblay, could not finish the book because it's about plague in an indirect way. I think they do zombies in that. There were a couple books that I couldn't finish because they were about that. So there is this kind of exhaustion about that, but I think the metaphor will always be very strong. I think that 2020 will give us some innovation. Like we were already seeing it. There was a movie that made my top list this year, which was kind of it started as a practical joke called Host, which is the movie that was done completely on Zoom. It took that as far as it could. And I still really liked it because I thought that they were clever about understanding what makes horror interesting is that you put up a whole bunch of little games that everybody has to touch. And then those things are going to come back and scare you later. So they set up a whole bunch of little contrivances and stuff like that that are going to happen with Zoom. And the idea that Zoom has become so synonymous with our lives at this point that they never had to explain anything. They just let a Zoom meeting happen. And they were smart enough to have it be the non-paid version of Zoom. So it was going to run out in an hour. So in and out, movies in and out. You're not going to spend a lot of time on it. There's not going to be a lot of exposition. It's going to be this thing that's happening right in front of you. And they use it very well. And they also put a timer on the movie. So you have this extra suspense, this countdown that's happening. The meeting's going to end in 5 minutes. Oh my God, she's trying to get out of the house and the ghost is after her. Whatever the thing is, it was working in there. So I think metaphorically, I think it's going to be interesting to, if we're talking about 2020 as disease, that's one thing. Politics is another. Socially, what we thought of each other is another. I think we've been in some of these places before, but not all at once. And I think people have gone just a little bit crazy, I may say. But I think we have some shorthand that's going to be happening. I think we're already seeing it. I don't know if you guys have noticed, but there's an awful lot of documentaries and movies about cults. Being someone who grew up in one, I noticed it immediately when we started having a lot of cult films, movies about I joined a cult, documentaries about I joined a cult, and that people were fascinated about it in the way it used to be fascinated about serial killers, when people were just on that cusp of serial killers and true crime. This kind of still falls into true crime, but it's this idea of believing indoctrination and cognitive dissonance. If there's one thing that I will say that maybe 2020 will give us, is that we are going to have a lot of examination about cognitive dissonance. The concept that point A doesn't meet point B, things are not quite making sense. There's an absurdity to everything, and you're wrong, but you'll never be able to admit that you're wrong because you are seeing an entirely different indoctrinated reality. We're almost like in an alternate reality. We don't have to worry about quantum physics giving it to us. We have it on our planet right now where there are multiple ways that we are in cognitive dissonance. Even people who are making sense in most of the ways in their lives, there's something about them that you won't agree with that seems like it's absolutely kerflooey crazy. It's amazing how we have not only science, not only religion, not only politics, disease. It's as if we are in this spot where we are not able to tell what is truth and what is fiction. There is a group in San Francisco and Oakland that used to do reality games, augmented reality games. It was like scavenger hunts and things like that through the city of San Francisco, basically giving people an alternate reality to play in. They won't do them anymore because they said, we can't risk playing that anymore. People have lost it. They're basically saying we can't play games with reality anymore because reality has gone into such distortion that when we start doing this, people are starting to believe that it's real immediately. So we're at this spot.
That's scary. Wild. To not exactly answer that question, but kind of adjacently answer the 2020 question. When all of this started happening is what I almost said, which it's hard to pinpoint like when that happened. But as it was happening, I kept recalling the short story from Carmen Maria Machado called Inventory. It's in the book, Her Body and Other Parties. it's amazing. And I just feel like it really encapsulates the sort of nuance that being alone for too long and it's out of your control can give a person. Hopefully none of us are all the way there, but she's a masterful writer. So I recommend her book. I also wanted to ask you, and I know that we're coming up on time, but I wanted to ask you as well, and we have a couple more questions from our audience.
Sure. I'll try and lightning round it.
Let's do it. So the last thing that you saw or read that made that little light bulb spark over your head where you were like, oh my God, that's genius. I have to go do some more stuff.
Oh, wow. Thing that I read or I saw. I would say there's two things. I'll go with book, The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones.
Okay.
The way that he plays with reality in there, and he gives you almost like a documentary on one spot and then a horror story in another and the personal drama. I really love that. And the story was crazy fresh. I really loved it.
Go ahead and add that to your cart when you push that little button right there for buy now.
Yes, exactly. Buy now, buy book. Only Good Indians is fantastic. I would also say Cosmology of Monsters by Sean Hamill. Really love that book. That's like John Irving making a ghost story and a monster story. It was really
fun.
And Afterland by Lauren Bucas. I really love that one. That's kind of an apocalyptic thing. It's kind of like, oh my goodness, what's Handmaid's Tale meets the apocalypse meets a road movie. It's really, really interesting. Oh, and Children of Men. You ever seen the movie Children of Men? Put those all together. That's Lauren Bucas's book. So all of those inspired me to want to still create. That there's exciting things that are being done. Movies of note. There are several that came out this year that I thought were really great because they did. I talk about how there's multiple rivers and streams, tributaries to horror, and there's many ways, whatever kind of horror you like, whether it be dread-filled gore, whatever, there's something out there for you. And this year there was a lot of spray amongst multiple genres. I think Hybrid Vigor, bringing two genres together to create something special, is always the winner. And La Llorona, not The Curse of La Llorona.
The one on Shudder?
Yes, the Salvadoran,
yes.
Guatemalan film. Oh my goodness, watch that. It's now I will say for people who are big horror film people, you're gonna have to. It's more of a slow burn, but it is like an M.R. James ghost story from turn of the century. It has that whole feeling. There's a movie called Personal Shopper that came out a couple of years ago, which is as close to M.R. James as I've ever seen. And it has that same thing of like you're going, what is happening? What is happening? Why am I so uneasy? And then in the end, it's like, bang, you have this very literate kind of scare, which is really, really great. The Dark in the
favorite film adaptation of a book?
Oh, favorite film adaptation.
Questions too.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, it's so hard for me to. It has to be a bad book made good, is how I look at it. So Jaws is a terrible book. It's a terrible book. If you've read the book, I mean, it ends with the shark having a heart attack. I mean, read it to believe it. But the movie is just so perfect. And I think I think a lot of times the movies that work the best are ones that understand that the book had a wonderful concept, but didn't know how to put it together. Or it's a shorter way of doing it. Kind of does.
I thought of two immediately, but just because the book, while you're reading it, feels like you're watching a movie in your mind. Like Silence of the Lambs.
Yes.
Is one of them where it's just like you could just kind of hold the book up and watch the movie at the same time. And it's like, yeah, it's right there. And No Country for Old Men. Both of them, that one I love them both so much. They're both my favorite books and my favorite movies. And I think that's really special when you can adapt a good book to a good movie. But to your point, like you can read something and be like, this is a good concept. I'm going to do them a favor and remake it into a new medium.
Well, I will say that the No Country for Old Men is amazing. And I love getting into arguments about that movie with people. That one and The Unforgiven. I see both of those as horror films. They have this epic shadow.
Unforgiven, but I think I agree, though. I think most Westerns and gangster movies are like very close to horror if they're not actual.
It depends on where they go and what they want you to go home with. That's the thing that's interesting. That's what changes. Because I always ask people, what the fuck is a thriller in the first place? I was like, well, it's a horror movie. It's not a thriller. Or it's a thriller. It's not a horror movie. I'm like, what is the concept of a thriller? I mean, what does that mean? What's the line of demarcation that does that? I could go on and on about that. But yeah, I would say that those are great choices. And I would say The Birds is also a great one. Daphne du Maurier's book is magnificent and much darker than the movie. But both of them are fantastic. So there you go. I'm breaking my own rule. It doesn't have to be a bad book to be a good movie.
It can be, though, to be a better adaptation or a good adaptation.
And Haunting of Hill House, both the miniseries Haunting of Hill House and the 1960 Robert Wise film The Haunting, both of them are magnificent adaptations of
good call.
Yeah, Shirley Jackson's book, which is just fantastic. And I could go on and on about what I think of the miniseries, and maybe someday if we have a virtual bar, we just hang out afterwards.
A real bar one day.
Yes, wouldn't that be great?
I have two quick questions that we can just kind of leave our listeners with. The first one is, I know that you have some questions that you haven't gotten to answer yet. So do you like hearing from people who think you're amazing, or are you Eminem?
I'm always confused that anybody finds me amazing, but I'm willing. I'm your Huckleberry. I can hang with somebody saying that I'm a nice person, but I do
all day. Yeah.
Yeah. My thing is that I love starting conversations. That's what this is all about. That's what the book is all about. That's what the podcast is all about. I love to hear people talk about their passions, whatever it is. I say
before I invited people to show up on your doorstep.
Show up on my doorstep's a different story. Show up on the doorstep of my email. That's the whole.
Right. And then, so my last question is, do you have some upcoming projects that you can talk about, just so we get more hype and traffic towards them?
Sure. I can't really announce something big yet, but I am in the process of a second book. And it's another look at horror, but it's looking at, I'm kind of reverse engineering everybody's hatred of horror. So I'm taking those things and I'm embracing them and saying, even with you saying that, here's what's really great about horror, and talking about what we can do to keep horror from going into small claims court of the supernatural, is what I call it. Which is
Love
basically
that term. That's my favorite thing.
So I think I'm going to have fun with that, and it's going to take a little bit of time to write, but I'm already starting to come up with little terminologies like red ball moments that has to do with moments in a movie that don't necessarily push the plot forward. What they do is they let the presence make itself known to the person who doesn't believe, but it only happens to them. So they are just even more tortured. Now that they know that what they thought might have been a mistake was real. And that comes from the movie The Changeling, with the red ball that bounces down the stairs of George C. Scott. Many movies have these aha moments, which are almost like a existential break. And I think they're wonderfully chilling. And they're a way to
realize she has conjunctivitis. Like in the opening, when they're having the prayer, and and you're like, oh, what's wrong with her eyes? And then it's like, that's your red ball moment. I got it. I love that term.
Yeah. So those are the kind of things. And I did want to say that I'm very grateful to Mysterious Galaxy for having me here. And I want to tell everybody to, if you can, buy a book through Mysterious Galaxy. It's a hard time for those who are putting books out there and letting you read what you want to read. And I'm sure wherever you are, whoever's listening, that there's a home store that you want to help as well. My book, I always say the ISBN number, you can find it on my webpage, which is www.hellbentforhorror.com. And you go there to the book, or you go anywhere on that, it'll show you ISBN page. And you don't have to go to the big box store in the internet. If you don't want to, you can literally go and help somebody. I think how we're going to get through this is being able to remember how much the arts and storytelling mean to us, and trying to help out in whatever way we can. And so I know this bookstore is good people. I know some people who have worked with them before, and they're really pretty infamous. Or not famous, not infamous. Infamous is like, what do they do? They're like setting fire. Yeah, there we go. They're pretty famous in the horror community. So I'm really I'm happy to have been here, and like I said, I'm happy to personalize any books, sign any books. If you want to sit there and do something good for this wonderful bookstore.
Thank you so much for the shout out and just the love of stories and books and for everything that both of you do. I can honestly say it has been an absolute delight for me as well as my roommate, who I'm hiding, to listen to the two of you tonight. Both of you, you can tell they know how to talk and they know how to express themselves well. And it was just such a pleasure getting to listen to you two in conversation. I'm like, I need to go listen to your podcasts now.
What a sweet thing to say.
Yay!
But both of you literally bring so much information and perspective, and it was just a pleasure getting to listen to you hear about horror. And I'm going to give a shout out really quickly to Rob, who is our horror expert at the store, because he's the one who will almost, maybe not single-handedly, but majority, he's put a lot of love into cultivating the horror section and the people.
Yay.
So, our horror guru, Rob, and I hate to have to end the event because it's such a treat getting to listen to the two of you, but it is at the hour mark, and you probably have other things as well that you need to do. So I'm going to give a huge thank you to all the readers and listeners for joining us. And thank you so much, Mary Kay, and thank you so much. I feel like I have to say your whole name, S.A. Bradley, for joining us.
Thank you for having us. This was so wonderful. Anytime I can talk with y'all about stuff I love, it's great.
Oh my gosh, I'm always interested in stuff like this. But hopefully for book 2, we will get to celebrate that in person. And then before we sign off, really quickly, can you give everyone your social media handles so that they can find you, get updated, and everything?
I have both. Whoa, almost just dropped all of my things. I have both of ours just stacked up.
Oh, wonderful!
Right there, and I will just drop them in the chat.
That would be perfect.
Okay.
So everybody, make sure if you're looking for good podcasts, interesting, awesome books, just the whole shebang of awesome
I don't know
things.
if the links went through. Okay, Squats did. Mine did not, but I'll find them real quick and add them in there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So fast.
Make sure you check out those links. And on that, we will say have a wonderful rest of your evening, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, everybody. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for all the questions.
Bye. Oh, wait. I can do this. I can end an event. Oh, my gosh. I'm so sorry. Bye, guys.